Patrick James Brennan, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Could I ask you to please state your full name?
Patrick James Brennan.
And you are the father of Liam Patrick Brennan?
Yes, I am.
Is it right that Liam died on Tuesday, the 14th of August of 2012, 4 days after he turned 29 years old?
Yes.
And you are here to give evidence about the circumstances of his care and treatment and his death, is that right?
Yes, I am, yeah.
You have indicated that you would be happy for me to refer to your son as Liam throughout these questions and to yourself as Patrick. So
Yeah, of course.
Now, by way of background, the inquiry sent you what we term a Rule 9 request, requesting your evidence for this inquiry, is that right?
Yeah.
And in response to that request, you provided a witness statement.
Yes, I did.
And Chair, as you know, a redacted version of this witness statement will be published on the website. You also gave a commemorative statement to the inquiry, which you read out in September of last year.
Yes.
And may I say that we are incredibly grateful to you for both of those accounts. Thank you. Do you have a copy of your witness statement in front of you?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Right at the top, it has your name on it?
Yes.
Yes. And the date being the 4th of June 2025?
Yes.
And is it right that on page 25, the last page of your statement, you have signed the statement?
I did sign it, yes.
Thank you. Have you had an opportunity to review this statement recently?
Yes, I have.
And are you happy that the statement is accurate?
I am, yes.
And is it right that you would like this statement to be considered your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Now, as you know, today I will be asking you some questions about this witness statement. We will not be going through it line by line, but we will be drawing on the themes that are set out therein. But you can be assured that the Chair and the inquiry team have read and will consider everything that is in the statement very carefully.
Okay, thank you.
And I remind you that you will not be asked to name any individual staff members due to the restriction order in place.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you. Now, we will be structuring your evidence in 3 parts today. First, we will go through a timeline of Liam's involvement with the Essex Mental Health Services, specifically NEPT. Second, I will ask you questions about your concerns relating to his care and treatment and how you as his father were treated following his death. And third and finally, I will ask you questions about your recommendations to the Chair in light of your experience.
Sure.
I will start therefore by going through a timeline of his involvement, and these are set out in paragraph 4 to 28 of your witness statement, in case that assists. As far as his early background is concerned, you start your statement by telling us that, like many people, Liam found his teenage years to be quite difficult. Is that right?
That is true, yes.
Especially from the age of 14 onwards. And where was he based at this time?
He lived in Barnet, which was the family home.
Thank you. And he had his first overdose at the age of 17, which resulted to him going to A&E and then a subsequent referral to the Priory in Barnet. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
And was that A&E also in Barnet?
Yes, it was Barnet General.
Was this his first interaction with any mental health service?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
And is it your understanding that in this consultation he was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder?
At the Priory, yes.
At the Priory. Is it right that during this time period you were in fact in Ireland?
Yes, I was.
Yes.
I was working on a 3-year secondment at that time.
I understand. And he was 17 at the time, so that would have been in around the year 2000, is
Correct,
that right?
yeah.
Other than this episode at the age of 17, is it right that he had no other engagement with mental health services prior to January 2011?
Not to my knowledge. No.
And you describe him in your statement as being in a good place emotionally throughout that time period.
Yeah, I mean, he was working for a while in Wales, and my wife and I went to visit him there. And he was enjoying working there, and he seemed to have a full life there. And then he decided he wanted to come back to London. I brought him back to London. We drove back, and he had a job working in a gastropub in Islington, I think, in the kitchens there. And then he later on had a similar job in Hertfordshire, Ayot Green.
A similar job in working as a chef, is that right?
Working as a chef, yeah.
And the way that you describe it in your statement is that he was generally in a good place emotionally in that time period. But is it right that there were periods where he just felt adrift, is the way that you phrased it, and that he just couldn't quite get his arms around it all?
I think he was always one of those people who seemed to me to find true or profound happiness quite difficult to achieve or feel all of the time. He was not materialistic at all, quite the opposite. But he was just one of these people who frankly just wanted to be happy, and a lot of the time I think he was. But there were occasions when he didn't feel like that, and it seemed to really get him down.
Did he experience that as a child before the incident of the overdose?
I think perhaps during his teenage years, I would suggest that was the case, but not necessarily during his primary school time, although he was quite strong-willed, and so therefore he's very much his own person, and he didn't necessarily go with the crowd, as it were, at primary school. But at the same time, he wasn't what you would regard as a loner, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you. And is it your evidence that in 2011 to 2012, that time period, you have referred to that he essentially went through a cycle of drug and alcohol misuse, A&E admission, mental health referral, inpatient stay, discharge, and repeat?
Yes, it was very much a admission, discharge, repeat process, borne out even more so once I actually got a copy of the hospital notes. I was obviously aware that he was going into hospital on these occasions, but when one looks at the hospital notes, it's very significant, and it's a real obvious trend that he was admitted. Then usually within a pretty short period he was then discharged, but then he would find himself needing to go back again.
Thank you. In terms of how I propose to structure the timeline going forward, if I've understood it correctly, there are in fact 9 cycles that he went through, and I propose to go through those 9 cycles now. The first cycle started in January 2011. He was 27 years old, is that right?
Yes, he would have been, yes.
And on that occasion, he stabbed himself in the leg whilst he was drunk, following which he went to A&E at Princess Alexandra Hospital. And is it right that he was referred to psychiatric liaison, but despite that referral, no psychiatric assessment in fact was undertaken and he was discharged?
That's correct.
So that was in January 2011. The second cycle starts in June 2011. And is it right that this one starts with his aunt being worried about his alcohol misuse, low mood and occasional thoughts of suicide, and therefore took him to A&E?
That's
correct,
right, yeah.
And at this stage, he was in fact assessed by a psychiatric liaison team and received a diagnosis of mental and behavioural disorder due to the use of alcohol, emotionally unstable personality disorder.
Correct, yes.
Was this diagnosis explained to you at the time?
No, it wasn't.
And do you know whether he was offered any home treatment following this diagnosis?
I'm not aware that he was offered any such treatment.
In fact, is it right that he self-referred himself to the Trust's Alcohol and Drugs Advisory Service and was appointed a counsellor with whom he had sessions intermittently?
Yes, he did.
Yes. And did you think that had a positive impact on him?
Yeah, I think Liam seemed to strike up a good relationship with the individual who was looking after him. And I'm aware that his mum valued those sessions as well, because they seemed to have a positive impact.
That's the second cycle. The third cycle starts on the 10th of August 2011, where he attended an outpatient clinic appointment at Princess Alexandra Hospital with a psychiatrist, who then, as I understand it, became Liam's responsible clinician. Is that right?
Correct.
And do you know what precipitated this attendance? Or was it simply an appointment that
I
he
must
had?
admit, I don't know.
And is it right that the diagnosis then changed to mental and behavioural disorder due to multiple drug use and use of other psychoactive substances, and this time it was mild, moderate depressive disorder without somatic symptoms?
That's correct.
And again, did you understand what this diagnosis meant at the time?
I wasn't aware of the diagnosis at the time.
I understand. And do you know whether he received any treatment following this appointment?
I don't know.
The fourth cycle starts in November of 2011 and results in his first inpatient stay. In November 2011, following what you believe was a heroin overdose, is it right that Liam was found unconscious in the street, taken to A&E, and then informally admitted to Chelmer Ward at the Darwin Centre in Harlow?
That's correct.
And was that his first admission?
It was, yeah.
And he was admitted on the 2nd of November, discharged almost 2 weeks later on the 16th of November. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And again, a slightly different diagnosis. Is it right that it changed to mental and behavioural disorder due to polysubstance and alcohol misuse, emotionally unstable personality disorder, borderline type?
That's correct.
So back to a personality disorder diagnosis.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, the fifth cycle starts on the 10th of December. And is it right that following what you understand to be self-harm, he was once again taken to A&E and then admitted to the Chelmer Ward?
That's correct.
And do you know if he received the same diagnosis this time?
I'm not aware. No.
And this time his admission was slightly longer, is that right? It was from
That's
the
right.
10th of December to the 17th of January. So a total of almost 5.5 weeks.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. The sixth cycle started on the 27th of February when his mother contacted the community mental health team and expressed her concerns. And is it right that he was then admitted to the Darwin Centre again?
Yes, he was, yeah.
This time it was Sturt Ward, is that
Yeah.
right? You set out in your statement that on the 13th of March, you in fact attended a meeting with Liam and his psychiatrist.
Yes, I did.
As you know, we will not be naming any staff members during the course of this hearing, so I will simply refer to them as Liam's psychiatrist. Is it right that his psychiatrist's advice was that Liam remain an inpatient?
It was, yes.
But Liam was concerned about the treatment he was receiving and did not think that the ward environment was doing him any good, and he felt well enough to leave. Is that right?
Similar to previous occasions when he received hospital treatment, he had reached a stage where he felt he was better off outside rather than in the ward.
Mm-hmm.
From a clinical perspective, I wasn't able to say whether that was a good idea or not, other than if my son felt that it wasn't doing him any good being in the hospital, then I helped him leave the hospital that day.
Thank you. So he, in fact, discharged himself
He
on that
did, yeah.
occasion. He was next admitted in April of that year, is that right? On the 7th of April,
Yes.
following an overdose. Is it right that following his overdose, he in fact tried to contact the Trust's crisis line, but the call went to voicemail?
Yes, it did, and Liam's mum, upon being told this by Liam, tried to contact the crisis line herself, only to receive the same voicemail message,
Yes.
which seemed to defeat the purpose of it being a crisis line.
Yes. And in fact, his mother called an ambulance.
To take him to A&E, yeah.
Yes. And following that, he was once again admitted to Chelmer Ward, is that right? And shortly thereafter, so that took place on the 7th of April. On the 10th of April, Liam's mother attended a care review meeting with Liam and his psychiatrist.
Yes.
And at this meeting, is that when they were told that a psychologist would not be available for a year?
That's correct.
And is it right that this prompted both Liam and his mother separately to submit complaints?
Yes, so Liam's mum sent an email to the hospital drawing their attention to Liam's previous suicide attempts and that having to wait a year for help just wasn't acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And expressing the fear that he might be successful in one of these attempts before help was going to be received. As you say, Liam at the same time submitted his own note of complaint,
Yes.
at which he expressed dissatisfaction with the treatment he'd received up till then, and just as importantly, the support he was getting in the community,
Yes.
and therefore wanting the support quicker than in 12 months' time.
Yes. And in fact, that complaint was received, and following this complaint, two things happened, is that right? One, an appointment was scheduled for Liam to have with a clinical psychologist.
Yeah, that took place on the 23rd of April.
That's right.
So having made the complaint, it does seem that was somehow fast-tracked, which was good news from our family's point of view, but why did it need to take
Yes.
a complaint to achieve it? The following day, the 24th of April, there was a meeting which involved Liam, his mum, myself, the operational services director, Liam's consultant that you've already just mentioned, and also a Making Experiences Count manager.
Yes. So two managers and the psychiatrist.
Yes.
Yes. And he, in fact, stayed in Chelmer Ward for some time until the 29th of May. Is
That's
that
correct,
right?
yeah.
And is it right that following the trust meeting that you just set out, the one on the 24th of April, Liam was in fact offered accommodation at NACRO, which is where he then went to stay?
Yes, he was. At that meeting, I mean, we expressed, and perhaps we'll come on to this later, I don't know, but
Yes.
just to highlight now that we expressed our lack of confidence in the diagnoses to date, the treatment plan, if there was one, that didn't appear to work, the cycle of admission and discharge that we've already mentioned, and the lack of support in the community.
Yes.
And I recall saying at that meeting that if this didn't turn out well, we all had to be able to look at ourselves and know that we've done our best, which was difficult to say in front of my son. I'm sure it was even more difficult for him to hear from his dad, but it just showed the level of desperation we had collectively from some help from the professionals. Not least because at that meeting, the central theme of advice that came out from the professionals was that Liam had to want to get better. To which I remember saying, don't you think we might have said that to him many, many times. And all that did was undermine our confidence even further that this was a clinical team that either understood Liam or had the first idea on how to actually help him.
What did they mean by Liam had to want to get better? Did they explain what wanting to get better and what that might mean he needed to do?
Sure. I don't recall them actually spelling it out. What I took it to mean then, and probably still take it to mean, is that if he didn't resort to alcohol or substance abuse, that would be a help, and that if perhaps he reacted more positively to some of the activities that were suggested for him when he was in the Chelmer ward, that might help too, and that perhaps his Liam's mood was such that he somehow had to try to lift himself out of this dark hole that he found himself in occasionally. But I think most of us on the outside of that conversation could probably appreciate that an individual who might find themselves in those circumstances needs help to do that. Simply being told to do it isn't going to achieve it.
So can I ask two supplementary questions? Were they also offering or suggesting that they would give him that help?
Well, I think they were hopeful that the psychologist support, which had only started the previous day, might be the start of a different work stream of help, if I can phrase it in that way.
So they weren't entirely placing the onus on Liam.
I think when you're in a meeting like that, I think that when you feel, and I can only speak for myself here, I'm not speaking for Liam at this juncture, but when you feel that the professionals haven't got a grip of what's actually wrong with him, it then means, well, what are you actually going to do for him? And I didn't get the impression they actually knew what to do. And so therefore, what comes across most loudly and clearly is this emphasis that he had to, Liam that is, he had to want to get better, using their words, and that would take us a significant step forward. And I do agree, it would do if he could do that.
And what was Liam's response to that? Was there a part of Liam that accepted that, or was Liam left as bereft as you sound as though you were?
I know that Liam just didn't have confidence in the team. I think he just didn't have a relationship with the consultant psychiatrist from the hospital. And that was clear from my meeting on the 13th of March, never mind the 24th of April. And indeed, on the 24th of April, to my memory, the consultant's psychiatrist said very little. It was principally the operational services director who did most of the talking on behalf of the trust. And I think that in many ways it left Liam no further forward nor behind than he was before. And I remember Liam, his mum and I talking outside the building after the meeting. And I think we were all at a loss as actually what to say to one another. It was such a dispiriting meeting that we were left certainly I was left thinking, I'm not sure what to do next. I'm not saying that nothing came of that meeting, because what had come, at least out of setting up the meeting, were the psychologists' meetings, which Liam did attend on the 23rd of April and continued to attend afterwards, and the accommodation provided by or organised by NACRO materialised, which was on the face of it a positive step forward also. So I think that despite the fact that the meeting left us at an impasse, something came of it, but perhaps, as we'll go on to find, some other elements of the support did not change. And I think key to that support, both from our point of view and actually from the Trust point of view, because this was pointed out several times by them, was that it was for the community psychiatric nurse who was allocated to Liam's case to pull all the pieces of the treatment jigsaw together. I have examples, which we'll come to later, of meetings he didn't attend. Liam certainly laboured the point on a number of occasions that guy didn't attend meetings that were set up for Liam, and that, of course, completely undermined Liam's confidence in the support he was getting. But that person, for reasons that were not explained on the day, didn't attend this meeting either. His apologies were given at the meeting, but for such a critical meeting, because for us that's a real pivotal moment, he wasn't there. And I think we probably regarded that as, at the time, as typical.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. We've got 2 more cycles to go through, if I may, before we then turn to your concerns.
Okay.
I'm grateful. The 24th of April meeting was in the middle of the 7th cycle, and he was discharged on the 29th of May. But is it right that he was then once again admitted on the 24th of June to Chelmer Ward? And do you recall what precipitated that admission?
I don't know.
And is it right that he was then discharged once again just under 2 weeks later?
That's right, yes.
Thank you. The 9th cycle starts...
If I may go back to that, though, again, there was a diagnosis given that at that time, according to the hospital records, that is slightly different to the ones that were outlined before. And this time it talked about emotionally unstable personality disorder, borderline type.
That's right.
And I don't know if it's right to touch on the fact now that when I met with Liam and the consultant psychiatrist on the 13th of March, Liam warned me going into that meeting. He said, "You're going to see diagnosis by Google here."
What did he mean by that?
Well, he told me that I would somehow be shown a Google definition of the diagnosis that had been formulated for Liam. And I must admit, I said to Liam at the time, "Look, don't be so cynical." You know, trying to play up the fact that these guys are trying to help you. But when I went into the room for the meeting, there was a screen up, and there was borderline personality disorder definition as per Google up on the screen. And although we didn't discuss in depth what that actually meant, it was used as a way of telling me that is what we think Liam's diagnosis is.
Mm-hmm. So was that in fact used for your benefit, to tell you what the diagnosis was?
Yeah.
The 9th cycle starts on the 2nd of August. Is it right that he had a confrontation with a new resident at the Nacro accommodation, following which he was briefly sectioned for his own safety?
Yes.
Yes. And did he, in fact, go to Chelmer Ward again on that occasion?
No, I don't think he did. I think he was taken to somewhere near Colchester,
Right.
but I can't remember offhand the name of the unit.
Thank you. And on the 3rd of August, is it right that the NACRO team tried to contact Liam's community psychiatric nurse, but were unable to get through?
That's correct.
And then on the 10th of August, it was Liam's birthday, and you understood he, in fact, spent a really good day with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
And then on the 13th of August, the NACRO team once again tried to contact Liam's CPN because she was concerned about his mental state.
Yes.
And that again was unsuccessful.
Correct.
And is it right that his CPN was in fact off sick?
That's correct.
A message was left for him to call back as soon as possible. It was written in the message book.
Yes, my understanding is that the call was made at about 4:15 that afternoon. As you say, the CPN wasn't available due to sickness. And so the process was that any such call would be recorded in their message book.
Yes.
And that someone would return that call, although clearly it didn't happen that day.
Yes. And on the 14th of August, Liam was tragically found dead at his NACRO accommodation,
That's correct.
having taken an overdose of prescription and non-prescription drugs.
Yeah.
Is that right? How were you informed of his death?
I was at home, and my wife brought out the phone to me and said Elaine, Liam's mum, was on the phone. So I took the call, and she said to me, Liam's died. And I was supposed to kind of buy time to process that. I said, how do you know? Because it was just a bolt. I could hardly believe it. And she said that there are 2 policemen in my sitting room, and they've just told me. And those policemen had called at the house, and I obviously found this out later, and Liam's mum hadn't come home from work yet, so my youngest son had to sit with them, but they wouldn't tell him why they were there. And it was only then when Liam's mum came home that they told her what had happened to Liam, and then she rang me.
Thank you. That took some time, but I'm grateful to you for confirming that background. It's important to ensure we understand the background to then understand the concerns that you are raising with this inquiry. So I'm very grateful to you. I would like to now move on to those concerns, and these are grouped in 6 overarching themes, although some might take a little bit longer than others. And just so that you know where we are going, I propose to just set them out to you, and then we'll go through them one by one.
Okay.
So the first is Liam's lack of confidence in the profession. The second is the ward environment and whether it is conducive to recovery. The third is how care management plans are developed and followed through. The fourth concerns his treatment. both his prescriptions and also psychological treatment in the community.
Yeah.
The fifth is in relation to these cycles of self-harm, admission, discharge, without a real grasp of understanding the underlying difficulties.
Yeah.
I believe you call this the firefighting approach.
Yeah.
And number 6 relates to post-death communication, so
Okay.
both with the trust and in relation to the inquest. So if I can take those in turn, the first is in relation to Liam's lack of confidence in the profession. You speak about the fact that he received different diagnoses over the 2011 to 2012 period, and within that you refer to a lack of a clear diagnosis and resulting uncertainty, and also a lack of confidence that this lack of clear diagnosis instilled in Liam and in yourself. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
When you were going through the cycles, you set out what each of the diagnoses were. Now, I've confirmed to you that I wasn't necessarily aware of them afterwards, until afterwards. But even on the diagnoses that had been communicated to me when I attended the meeting alongside Liam in March 2012, although that diagnosis was up on the board, there was little by way of explanation on the part of the consultant that explained what that actually meant, both in terms of what did it mean, how did Liam's behaviour lead to that diagnosis being made, and equally, what did that mean for his ongoing treatment as a result of that? I was also aware that, Liam was a bright guy. He would go through periods of self-analyses to try to work out for himself what was wrong. And he had put forward the view that whether or not, given what he knew about himself and what he knew, for example, about Asperger's from the point of view of his own research, there are a number of elements that he thought aligned in that way. He actually raised it with the hospital, because I've seen it in the hospital notes since. But there was nothing in the hospital notes that said, and we've rejected that because of X, Y, and Z, or we've explained that that isn't an accurate diagnosis for whatever reason. I think that led Liam to feel a lack of confidence in both what was being said to him and the treatment plan that was therefore laid out as a result of that. And if he didn't feel confident in it, how were we, as members of his extended family, are meant to feel confident in it? I think what's key in all of this also are relationships. And it was really clear to me when I had the meeting on the 13th of August, given that Liam and the consultant had been in dialogue, had been meeting, had come across one another for the best part of 6 months by that stage, and there was just no semblance of relationship between them. And look, not every relationship works. I absolutely accept that. But if it's, I think even more for mental health compared to physical health, if the relationship isn't there, then the confidence won't be there. That undermines the stability, I think, of the patient in terms of how they believe they're going to get better. And I just feel the culmination of that really just meant that there was that underlying lack of confidence and therefore probably trust. in what was being said to him, as I say, around his diagnoses. I think also when there are, and I'm presuming that Liam would have had these various diagnoses communicated to him, and Liam, I think as an individual, was quite a literal person, the kind of person that if you said you were going to meet him at 4 o'clock, you had to meet him at 4 o'clock, okay? Not 15:15, it's 4 o'clock. He could be late, by the way, but in that sense, if he's hearing a different form of words each time, that's telling him they don't know. And the way I equate it in my mind is that somebody can start off with a cough. So if they got a chill, a cold, the beginning of COVID, the beginning of pneumonia, flu, it could develop into any of those things. The treatments for those will be slightly different. The outcomes might be certainly different. So therefore, if all of these different diagnoses are taking place, how do we know at any given point in time that we know that the severity or the nuances shouldn't lead to a different treatment plan being followed? Or, alternatively, and I would accept this too, that they're actually all variations on the same theme and they all add up to the same thing. But in the absence of any explanation, we don't know.
Yeah. And do you think that that had any impact on his treatment in terms of the way in which he received it?
I think on one level, who knows, okay? Because certainly in terms of, for example, prescription or psychiatric or psychologist support, it may not have had an impact. It depends on whether they were variations on a theme or quite different diagnoses. What certainly didn't work, regardless of the diagnosis, was the mechanics of the treatment plan.
Yes. And we will go on to that in a moment. Thank you. But before we go there, if I could ask you in relation to the second concern, which is the ward environment. Now, you have spoken in your statement for some length regarding the environment of the ward. You referenced the activities and the food that was provided. And although you're not, it seems to me, overly critical of the ward environment, you do suggest that Liam sought to discharge himself in part because he didn't think that it was one that was conducive to his recovery. First of all, is that right?
That is correct.
And if so, what do you think it was about the ward environment that wasn't quite right?
Okay. The first thing I should say is I didn't go into the ward myself. When Liam and I met when he was in hospital, he was always well enough to be able to walk around the hospital estate, as it were. So we were free to do that. Liam sometimes referred to the activities that they were asked to do, and some of them he thought were quite good, quite interesting, and others he just thought were plain silly and childish. I think that certainly from what Liam told us, and from what a couple of family members who did go into the ward saw, was that there were a whole range of people there with very differing behavioural traits that could be regarded as quite intimidating or even frightening. Liam, in his way, said he was one of the few normal people there. And I mean that as in quoting Liam, I mean that as no disrespect to any of the other patients who were there, and nor do I mean any disrespect to the inquiry in saying that. But nevertheless, he felt perhaps he was one of the less extreme, shall we say, less extreme behavioural traits. And where you have such a range within a necessarily confined environment, it's no wonder if somebody feels better than when they were admitted, they might want to then accelerate their own discharge, even though it may or it may not be the best thing for them. I just felt, I suppose, that particularly in the earlier times when Liam went in, he actually just needed a short period of stabilisation, and then he came out again and he was fine. But I'm not sure that anything happened on the ward that actually helped him regroup, in the sense that he came out knowing what was wrong and how he could deal with things going forward. It was very much I suppose I've termed it as a holding pen, where a whole group of people with disparate needs were housed for a period pending something else happening. I think in my statement I've also made an observation. It's not necessarily a criticism, but it's an observation that it was a mixed sex ward. Liam formed a friendship and an attachment with somebody who probably he felt was quite similar to him in terms of needs and kind of perhaps diagnosis. And they formed a friendship that certainly on the face of it seemed to be good for both of them. When you've got a group of, I suppose my observation would be for the inquiry to consider that when you've got a group of vulnerable people together in an enclosed environment, whether such attachments are perhaps inevitable, sometimes they will be for the mutual good, but one can also imagine circumstances in which it might not be a healthy attachment, or if those attachments go awry, there'll be a fallout from that, which in itself will only complicate the issues being felt by both parties. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Obviously, the inquiry will see the aggregate of everybody's observations and come to its own conclusion accordingly.
Thank you. Before I move on to the care management plans, which is the third concern, I wonder whether, is it right that you feel that Liam's case is one where he would have been better treated in the community, essentially, but that the community's support simply wasn't there for him or wasn't there at the right level for him? Would that be fair?
Okay, so I'd make 2 points there, I suppose. What was, in terms of the treatment or the care plan rather itself, it seemed to consist to a certain degree in Liam's case of prescription plus community activities and support. And in Liam's case also accommodation. So I suppose there are 3 elements to pull together to make the whole thing work for Liam. Of course, the 4th element is Liam himself. the person who is key to all of that is the community psychiatric nurse role. They appear to be, as far as the plan is concerned, they're the person who you can regard as either pulling it together or making it happen. And so much success of the treatment plan, I think, relies upon obviously that individual being conscientious about their job and being sufficiently skilled to deliver it, and having a good relationship with what they would call their client. In this case, Liam. I think the second part of the going to your question about support in the community, I don't know whether the prescriptions that were set out for Liam were the right ones or not. That would be that's much more of a clinical question. I think, though, what Liam really needed was help with those occasions in life when he thought things were getting bleak, when he could see this kind of dark period coming up. What triggers could he use? What, if you like, almost management tools could he use or could he employ to help him through those moments? We all have techniques that we use every day, all of us, to do things like that. We don't regard ourselves as having mental health conditions, but they just help us cope with certain situations. Liam lacked those, and therefore needed support and guidance to develop them, and then to practice them, and then to use them. And that seems to have been entirely missing from the care plan.
Would it be fair to say that the care plan was sort of presented to him as a product? He wasn't necessarily involved in developing it. And whilst he didn't necessarily have an issue with the care plan per se, it was the follow-through of the care plan that was the problem in his situation.
I think in Liam's case, I suppose he wanted to have input in terms of the diagnosis because he wasn't confident in it, and he had his own alternative, which may or may not have been wide of the mark. But I think he would have been happy to have been presented with a care plan and would have believed in it if he had thought that the follow-through wouldn't happen. What was clear as 2012 particularly progressed, actually no, it's fair to say in 2011 also, that just that lack of follow-through, that lack of having someone he could reliably call upon, an example of being even like the fact that you have a crisis line given to you to call in the event of you knowing you're feeling bad, and all you get is an answer phone. That's not particularly helpful at all. I think on at least one, if not two or three of the occasions that Liam was admitted to Chelmer, it was on his own referral, and he was never taken unwillingly there. So he knew he needed help, but it was just how to access it at the time that he needed it. Yeah. And it wasn't just he who found that, it was NACRO as well.
Yes, hence the two unanswered
calls on the 2nd of August and on the 13th of August. Yeah. And I think a conversation between NACRO and the Community Mental Health Trust did take place on the 3rd of August, in which it was really NACRO just setting out that in certain circumstances we're going to need your support and help. So basically, can we have it, please? And then, of course, just 10 days later, they did need it. And, okay, on that day, it turns out that the community psychiatric nurse was off sick, and anybody can be off sick, but, well, surely to God there's cover in place. And it's incredible that we, through the medium of an inquiry, we've got to suggest that that might be a good thing to have in place. I think the other, if I may just say, one of the other things about the care plan that struck me, I've no experience other than through Liam of even seeing a care plan. But in most other walks of life, if you have a plan to do something, quite early on in that plan, you actually set out what you're trying to achieve, what the objectives are, or even in more clinical parlance, what the outcomes should be. Nowhere in any of the versions of the care plans I've seen from the hospital notes since have I seen it set out anywhere what a good outcome would be for Liam.
Right.
Because if you don't have that objective or vision really set out right at the beginning, how do you even know what you're working towards? And I think that is it just plays into this whole firefighting regime where the trust seemed to devote its attention and resources to just conveyor belting patients through Chelmer Ward without actually stopping the conveyor belt and saying, how can we prevent this from happening again? What is it we need to do? And what can this patient, given all we know about them, reasonably expect as a result of a treatment plan that's set up with a fair wind? I did have a discussion post Liam's death with, when I met again with the Making Experiences Count manager. I think this was in January 2013. But she brought with her to the meeting a member of their substance and abuse team, who I believe was a psychiatrist, and I hadn't met him before that. But he was very forthright with me about what I should have been able to expect Liam to do and for the trust to do. And one of the points that I made a note of, and I've come across it since, was that he said that substance abusers who don't have an underlying mental health condition can't get out of this cycle by themselves. They need help. Which cuts across what was being told to me on the 24th of April and goes to the point, I think, that was made actually in the opening remarks by counsel to the inquiry about having a mental health condition shouldn't be regarded as a terminal illness. And there's an email from me back to the Making Experiences Count manager after that meeting, in which I thanked that person for their directness and honesty, and for also making clear that for vulnerable people, death was not an inevitability.
Yes. And I suppose even if individuals who are struggling with substance abuse without mental health conditions need help, then what does that say about those who also have mental health conditions?
Well, I imagine it can only be worse, but I think that allied to the fact that then if people involved in delivering that care plan don't step up to the mark, and I think in Liam's case the role of the community psychiatric nurse frankly failed.
Yes.
There were several instances of Liam telling me that he had failed to keep appointments. His mum at the time confirmed that to me as well, and she was exasperated by it. There's a note in the hospital records in February 2012 saying that that person was meant to attend a meeting and didn't. I've already mentioned that he didn't attend the meeting on the 24th of April either. He couldn't be contacted on the 3rd of August, nor could he be contacted on the 13th of August. At least 3 of those were critical or pivotal moments in Liam's particular timeline.
Yes. Thank you. Still on care management plans, I have one more topic to cover with you in relation to that, which is your involvement and Liam's mother's involvement. Do you think that the level of your involvement was appropriate?
I think we had got to the stage where during 2011, when we were just, as I said earlier, I think we were desperate for professional help. Us wanting to help Liam, us wanting him to get better was not enough. We needed help. And we would have been happy to leave that to the professionals if we felt that they were getting a grip of it. I got involved on the 13th of August because I think Liam felt he wasn't getting anywhere, and he asked me to attend that meeting because he thought perhaps I could be more assertive on his behalf to move things along. And I came out of that meeting just feeling, well, just knowing how difficult it was for Liam to move it along, which is why then when we created the opportunity to have the 24th of April meeting, we thought it's all or nothing on this. And as I mentioned, we just came out of it feeling we were at an impasse. If we had the answers, we'd have input them into the care plan. But we didn't know what the answers were. And actually we didn't know what the problem was, the underlying. If we had certainty about the underlying problem, perhaps we'd have, through our own research, had a bit more certainty about what we'd have liked to have seen happen in response to that. We had to get involved, but I appreciate that Liam, by that age was a 28-year-old adult. So you wouldn't necessarily automatically expect the parents to be actively involved necessarily in a care plan like that. Although I would have hoped by the fact that both Liam's mum and I attending meetings, we showed we were happy to be actively involved.
Thank you. If it's all right with you, I propose to deal with one more concern, which is the concern about his treatment, before perhaps taking a short break and then finishing the concerns and dealing with your recommendations. Is that all right?
Of course.
Thank you. Now, in terms of his treatment, there are 2 points really well, 3 in fact, that it seems you make in your statement. The first is in relation to prescriptions.
Yeah.
Now, you refer to issues with the GP being the gatekeeper for medication in situations where there has been a referral to a specialist. It strikes me that your concern here is really to do with the disconnect between the different services. Is that right? And do you have anything further to say about that?
Okay, so it was only as a result of the 7-day report that came out after Liam's death that the person writing that report had actually highlighted that there was a discrepancy between what Liam's consultant psychiatrist was. At one point, there was a discrepancy between what the hospital were prescribing and actually what was on Liam's record at his GP.
Yes.
And it turns out that the process for communicating a change in the prescription was that the community psychiatric nurse should ring a GP's practice and say there's been a change in the prescription, this is the new prescription.
Mm-hmm.
Because the CPN couldn't get hold of the GP on a given date, he sent a fax, but it didn't appear that fax had actually been actioned.
Right.
Which strikes me as a completely balmy way of updating a prescription, even allowing for how technology has moved on since. Emails were very much the order of the day in 2011, 2012, and White needed phone calls. You can imagine there's just so much scope for things being taken down incorrectly, even doses, whatever. It just sounds a completely wrong way of doing it, as well as being extremely time-consuming and not particularly timely either.
Yes.
In terms, when I got a copy of the hospital file eventually, I found an exchange of correspondence between the consultant psychiatrist and the GP, where the GP had raised an issue about whether the prescription that the consultant had suggested was in fact the right one. So that tells me that even on one particular level, there was a level of professional disagreement. So to the first issue, it's really about a process, and there's got to be a better process than the one that was in place. In the second issue, again, it just goes to underline, I suppose, my lack of confidence as to whether the clinical team at the hospital really had their arms around this.
Mm-hmm. And whether he in fact got the right prescription.
Indeed.
Yes. We have spoken to some extent about the lack of psychological support for Liam in the community. Is it right, well, is it your understanding that prior to the April meetings, there was no one-to-one counselling in the community for Liam?
That's correct, yeah.
So that only came in place once the complaints were put in, essentially. Yeah. Now, also in your statement, you set out that Liam struggled with addiction during his teenage years and thereafter, and you provide a bit of context to that, relating to kitchen shifts, which can be very full on, and how it can be quite difficult to wind down after work, and that might be where the alcohol seemed to help him to begin with.
Yeah.
It's right, isn't it, that he received some support from ADAS, but he did not receive any specific addiction-focused treatment?
No, he didn't. Liam was told, and I was aware of this, that he should attempt to reduce his alcohol and substance intake, particularly when he had been admitted for those, as a result of those very things. And indeed, again, from the hospital notes that I've seen since, they say that the patient has been advised to reduce his alcohol and substance intake, but beyond actually just telling him to do it.
Yes.
I think people need support sometimes to do that. Not everybody can just resolve to make that decision and then follow through with it. And that was just reinforced in my mind when I met a member of the substance abuse team at the meeting in January 2013. And that's not been, I don't think, smart after the event. I think what one suspected was actually borne out then by a professional.
And by suspected, do you mean suspected that he should have had this treatment and he didn't?
Indeed,
have it?
yeah.
Understand. Thank you. I wonder whether now might be a good time to break, Chair.
How long were you suggesting?
10 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes and break.
Very good. 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. We were just about to start your fifth concern, as set out in your statement, which, in fact, you have answered quite a few of my questions in relation to. But there is one outstanding question, and here we're really dealing with the cycle that Liam found himself in. I wondered whether you could tell us a bit about your impression of the communication between inpatient ward staff and the community staff.
I'm not really sure how that worked. I imagine that the treatment plans that were set out, that somehow the CPN, who was the person pulling all that together, would have received a copy of the treatment plan, because there were a list of people at the bottom right-hand corner on the plan showing who the plan was distributed to. Mm-hmm. Although on one particular occasion, I think it was following our meeting on the 24th of April, it said that a copy of the plan had been distributed to the parents.
But it wasn't.
I didn't receive a copy. I've since asked Liam's mum whether she can recall receiving a copy, and to the best of her knowledge, or recollection I should say, she didn't.
Right. So is it your evidence that essentially you were not aware of what communication, if any, there was?
That's correct.
I'm grateful. If I could now move on to the last concern, and this will be broken up in three parts, and this really relates to the time period after Liam's death. First, I want to talk to you about the immediate post-death, then the inquest, and then subsequent discussions that you had with the trust. What took place after Liam died on the 14th of August?
Excuse me. The next day, Liam's mum and our daughter went to a local funeral directors to try to start making arrangements. But neither Liam's mum nor our daughter, or indeed I, although I wasn't at that meeting, were aware of where Liam was. And the funeral director took it upon herself to try to find out, and found out that his body was at the mortuary at Princess Alexandra's Hospital. Once we found that out, we then made arrangements to go and see him.
You have also previously referred to the manner in which you found out that Liam had died. In hindsight, what do you think of the manner in which you were spoken to and informed of matters in the days that followed his death?
Well, certainly from my own perspective, I had no contact from the trust or NACRO. The police were in contact with Liam's mum, A, because they informed her that Liam had been found dead, and B, they had formed the view that there were no suspicious or reasons for them to investigate further. And I made contact with the police then on a couple of occasions to arrange a meeting so that I could understand what they found, because I just felt I didn't know enough about the circumstances around his death to feel at least that I knew what had happened. They felt they had initially, they'd covered all that off with Liam's mum, which they had. But I wanted to hear it for myself. And eventually they agreed to come round to our house, and we met one evening for a short period, and that was fine. And then we saw them again at the coroner's inquest. But I think that it seems remarkable, doesn't it, that someone should have died in the care of a health authority and that no member of our family received communication from the health authority. Although I found out later via the 7-day report that some counselling support had been offered to Liam's mum, which is absolutely fine, but not to any other member of our family.
I would like to ask you some questions about that 7-day report, if I may.
Yeah.
Without telling me the names of anyone, do you remember in what circumstances you were made aware of its existence?
It was early in 2013. I was having conversations with the Making Experiences Count manager that led up to a meeting with her, and she said in passing, well, have you seen the 7-day report? Because it was clear from our conversation that it obviously triggered something for her to say it, and I'd never even heard of a 7-day report. So she arranged for it then to be sent to me. So that was the first I knew of it.
And you set out in your statement that you had numerous concerns about the report. And I wonder whether I can briefly summarise my understanding of your main concerns and then ask you some more general questions about it. You were concerned about the use of initials, which you said goes to the point about candour and accountability.
Yes.
You were confirmed in your understanding that Liam's diagnosis had been bounced around. Through the 7-day report, you became aware of the disparity in relation to his prescription.
Yes.
You were concerned about the selective nature of the content. There was a general attitude of, we did our best and it was because of his substance abuse and the like. There was no mention of the 2 meetings that you attended. There was no mention of the complaints made. There was no mention of the unsuccessful calls to the CMHT in the week before his death, the 6th and I think it was the 3rd and the 13th of August, in fact. And there was suggestion in the report to effective collaboration, which you dispute was in fact effective. There was also a suggestion of effective follow-up and the use of supportive interventions, which you disagree with. The report also highlighted a discrepancy in the time of death. It made speculative conclusions about Liam's intention before any toxicology or coroner's report. And it made only very narrow recommendations, essentially to do with paper records only. Is there anything else that you would like to add in relation to these concerns?
You've summarised them very clearly, and that's fine. I suppose it's worth, from my point of view, clarifying that we talked earlier about the cycles, and I think it's important to say that Liam had periods in between of those when he was perfectly fine, and our interactions and all of that confirmed that. When he started going into his dark periods, if I can express it that way, it was then that he resorted to things like alcohol and other things, rather than that being a constant feature of his life. So in other words, they were the tools he was using to try to get out of those periods in the absence of having any, frankly, better tools to work his way out of them. So I think it's worth clarifying that. I think in terms of how this idea of collaboration, I'd suggest, for example, the interaction between the hospital and the GP was an example of when it didn't work. The failure of the CPN role was another example of when it didn't work. The fact that NACRO couldn't get the help they needed for Liam when it was needed, that didn't work. And you may even go as far as to say, so what was the role of NACRO in terms of what was expected of them as the accommodation providers, and was that working? And how can any of this be assessed when you haven't got a set of objectives or outcomes that were the target that everybody was aiming for? So against that, there is nothing to measure about whether what the hospital or what the trust was doing for Liam was actually working. There's a section of the 7-day report which talks about general risk assessment, I think, and that claims that there had been good risk assessment in place, and then merely went on to list essentially a number of the reasons why it was perhaps inevitable that Liam had died. I'd then go on to, I suppose, say that in summary, they, as you have rightly said, the person writing the report has speculated what might have happened. And that's before any toxicology report had been received, or indeed the coroner's inquest had taken place, and it's their role to determine that, as is my understanding. That they had seen good collaboration taking place. An example of that in the report, they say, was Liam's mum being offered support when it was needed. This report was about a 29-year-old man who had died. Its one concrete recommendation was that electronic papers should be filed the right way up in the trust systems so that they can be easily accessed and read. When I challenged that at the coroner's inquest, I was told that that was actually very important. And it might be. But if any individual of a relatively young age dies, there must be more to learn than just that. There must be, because Liam's wasn't an expected death. It wasn't even a death that should have happened. If he had received, I think, the help in identifying the coping mechanisms that he needed for day-to-day life, I think he would have stood a very good chance of coming through the dark periods that he experienced. And frankly, I'm not sure who gains out of a report that says, after all of that has happened, and it's taken us a long time to go through all that's happened just at this inquiry. And the thing we learn is that we've got to file the papers the right way up. That doesn't reflect well on the trust. That doesn't actually help the professionals in the trust do a better job. It doesn't help our family. And it doesn't help future families.
Thank you. I want to move on to the inquest, if I may. Liam's inquest was held at Chelmsford Coroner's Court before Mrs. Caroline Beasley Murray. Did you engage in this inquest?
I did, yes.
Did you have legal representation?
Sorry, legal representation?
Yes. No. Did you receive any kind of guidance or support in the process?
I received a booklet of several pages describing what a typical inquest does, what its remit is, and what the protocols were on the day.
Could you tell us a little about your experience of engaging in this inquest, please?
So on the day we arrived at the inquest, and actually it turned out that there were quite a few family and friends who were there to support us on the day. And we were in quite a small room, as it turned out, with members of the trust, which made for a pretty tense environment prior to the inquest taking place. Then a gentleman came in to just say that we were to be respectful at all times, and he didn't want any raised voices or anything like that taking place at the inquest. I don't know if that's because he could sense it was going to be emotionally charged, but that's what he said anyway, and I'm not sure. I know at the time it wasn't a particularly helpful intervention. It may have been regarded as a necessary one, I don't know, but we're quite polite people. We didn't intend to behave badly. So the inquest then took place, and the coroner set out her remit, which was very narrowly to define who had died, why they died, when they died, how they died, but crucially not why.
Do you have any views about the remit of a coroner?
I think that it was clear, and it would be clear to the inquiry from the transcript of the inquest that I've shared with the inquiry, that we had questions arising not just from the 7-day report, but the whole manner of what you might regard as Liam's treatment plan, and indeed the manner of his death and what happened around that. And I felt that with my interactions with the trust right from the beginning, I had little confidence that there wouldn't be a whole raft of people appearing before similar inquests, because I told the coroner's hearing that, in my view, the position of other families was going to be just as we found, which was hopeless, literally without hope. It was clear that at the coroner's hearing that the representatives put forward by the trust to speak on their behalf, first of all, it was meant to be the previously mentioned operational service manager, who at least did know Liam's case. But she was on holiday, couldn't attend, and therefore this other person was put forward in her place. I think if such a critical person representing the trust, that perhaps should have been grounds for a delay to the inquest hearing. Anyway, that didn't happen. I felt that the person they did put forward was intent on damage limitation to the trust. And as I mentioned earlier, defended the 7-day report by saying that that particular recommendation was an important one for them to follow. But she really wasn't briefed on Liam's case. And on one particular occasion, I had to remind her of Liam's name. And it just highlighted to me just the lack of seriousness, I suppose, with which the trust treated both Liam's death and the inquest. And as is borne out by the fact this inquiry is even in existence, I wasn't wrong when I said there would be others. On reflection, given that this inquiry covers the period 2000 to 2023, so we were 13 years into that period, and we're talking about the Essex Mental Health Trust here, and therefore deaths in Essex. Who or why wasn't the coroner's office beginning to join some dots and asking itself, why are we having to have so many inquests for people who die unexpectedly, given they're in the care of the local health authority? And if families like ours can't rely on the trust to live up to a duty of candour, and perhaps we'll come on to that, and we can't rely on coroners' courts to question what's going on, where are we meant to turn to make sure it's better in the future?
The inquest, is it right that it resulted in an open verdict with the cause of death being mixed drug overdose? And there was also generally an encouragement for discussions with the trust to continue. How did this conclusion make you and your family feel?
I've no argument with the open verdict. I mean, it's, from any family's point of view, it's not a satisfactory one. But I understood the coroner's line of reasoning in coming to that conclusion. at the time, probably I wasn't in the frame of mind to argue back the point about keeping talking. But in retrospect, that is incredibly lame. And I mean, there have been many instances since where I've read, both online and in the press, about coroners giving their opinion or saying that something here doesn't seem right and it should be investigated further, or something like that. And I've often thought, why didn't our coroner say that? Or even if our coroner didn't think it was the right thing to say in the inquest at that point in time, why didn't the coroner's office instigate something that would have been helpful to future families?
Thank you. I wonder whether we can now move on to any discussions that took place with the Trust after the inquest. And I am thinking in particular of the meeting on the 8th of April, which you have already referred to. I wonder whether you could tell us more about that meeting.
We'd had an earlier meeting in January, which had, we clarified a couple of points, but there was still a number of points outstanding. So I wrote to the then Chief Executive Officer asking to meet him, listing a number of points that I wanted to raise with him, given that I felt that, I felt that they had not been answered to date, despite my emails and previous meeting. They acknowledged my letter, and eventually the Chief Executive Officer came back saying, I've asked two members of my team, one of which was the lady who represented the Trust at the coroner's hearing, and another of her colleagues to meet with me. My daughter and I attended that meeting, and we, I suppose in the form of an agenda, we went through those individual points one by one. I had requested a copy of Liam's hospital file, which by the time, between the letter to the Chief Executive Officer and the meeting, I had received that, so I had a chance to work my way through that. I wanted them to acknowledge that some of their actions and processes really just hadn't helped Liam at a time when he needed help. I just felt that the Trust hadn't used this as an opportunity to genuinely learn lessons when an organisation like NACRO had. And of course I had a number of misgivings about the 7-day report that we've just gone through. So that was why we wanted the meeting and what we wanted to cover with them.
And as the father of a young man who died whilst under the care of the Essex Trust, do you feel as though the manner in which you were treated during these discussions was appropriate?
I think it was true then, and I still feel it in retrospect now, that there might have been a superficial attempt to learn very limited lessons, such as the process for dealing with prescriptions, for example, prescription changes, and how that might be improved. But we've already mentioned, for example, that on the 13th of August, the day before Liam was found dead, NACRO had contacted the Community Mental Health Trust, and the query or the request for help had been put in a message book. And what kept coming back to me, and this was reinforced by a member of by the director who attended the meeting on April the 8th, was that had the word urgent been used, that might have got a different response. It meant that the duty worker, whoever that might be, might then have picked that up and phoned NACRO back. From my career, okay, I know what corporate defensiveness looks like and feels like. Unfortunately, I've had to do it in the past, so I know it when I see it. In fact, the first thing we said when we went into that room is, we are not here looking for compensation from the trust. Because I knew that, or I felt that everything up to that point had been around liability management. And the body language of that director visibly changed in front of me to a more relaxed pose when I said that. It shouldn't take that sentence for everyone as fairly rational adults to try to learn their best from a bad situation. And as I said to the chief executive when I wrote that letter to him requesting the meeting, the defensiveness of the trust at the time only managed to make what was already a very bad situation worse. And that is what the trust had managed.
You previously made reference to the duty of candour, and you said that we may come back to it. And I wonder whether we can do that now before we move on to recommendations for change. Was there anything that you wanted to say about the duty of candour?
I mean, I'm aware of it because subsequent to Liam's death, I'm aware of it because I was later on, I was trustee and chair of a hospice. And so duty of candour was one of the principles that, although we weren't formally part of the National Health Service, we adopted because so many of our staff were ex-National Health Service, and indeed it seemed a good principle to work by. But it's not a principle that you can pull out of the drawer when it's required. So in other words, if something bad happens, you don't pull it out and then throw it around as a phrase liberally to show that you're going to try to get to the bottom of it, whether you're going to try to or not.
Yeah.
It's actually an ethical code by which you live in your working environment. And it presupposes that every day is a school day, and that you're going to learn professionally, both in terms of your continuing professional development, but also in terms of genuinely understanding when things go wrong, hold your hands up and let's make sure it doesn't happen again, and put changes in place that ensure that doesn't happen again.
Thank you.
At no time did that approach appear to be exhibited ever by the trust in my dealings with them, if I may say, nor since in their representations that I've seen to this inquiry.
Thank you. You set out that your primary aim in your involvement with this inquiry is to contribute to a list of recommendations that will hopefully improve the quality of care for future patients with mental ill health. And unless there's anything else that you wanted to say about the concerns we've raised so far, I wonder whether we could now turn to your recommendations, which are at paragraph 86 of your statement. And I wonder if we could perhaps take them in turn. The first that you set out is mental health equivalency. And you state that mental health needs must be viewed as and treated as equal to physical health. Is there anything additional that you would like to say in relation to that recommendation?
The analogy I draw when trying to rationalise that to myself, because I understand that this is actually in law, but the analogy I draw for myself is if I break my leg, and assuming it's not too difficult a break, I'm pretty confident it's going to be fixed. If I have a mental health condition, I'm not equally confident that I will come through the other side the way I'd like to.
Your second recommendation relates to a patient-centred service and the adoption of a principle that there is essentially one patient, one plan, one accountable clinician, and one agreed set of desired outcomes. Is there anything further that you wanted to say in relation to that recommendation?
No, I mean, in my working life, whenever you've got plan, you've always got an accountable individual. I can understand if people think that having an accountable individual means that we've got someone to blame. That's not my reason for saying it. And if somebody is uncomfortable with being the accountable individual, my suggestion would be that perhaps they're not right for that role. Okay. I think if you think of all the different moving parts around Liam's care plan, okay, so the hospital, the CPN, the GP, NACRO, psychologist support that was coming on board. Everyone has got to know what they're working towards. It's not about them doing their individual bits that don't necessarily complement the other parts of the treatment plan. So that's why it should be really clear, both to the professionals and to the patient, of exactly what we're trying to achieve here. And that all the individuals involved in it should buy into it. And if they don't, then they're not part of the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Non-judgmental approach.
Yes, the next one is a non-judgmental approach. You essentially set out that, well, acknowledging that some lifestyles may not help, mental health issues are not and should not be seen to be the fault of the patient, essentially. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary. I mean, I mentioned earlier about some of the relationships not being as they should be.
Yes.
You just can't help feeling, is there an element of judgment that's gone into that? That's really got to be put to one side.
Thank you. There's then the duty of candour and lesson learning. We've just discussed this. You state in your recommendation that the NHS should genuinely embrace this duty of candour and not just display it as a cultural value that exists for PR purposes only. Is that a fair summary? Thank you. You've referred to, you state one must communicate clearly and abandon jargon. You state that acronyms are difficult to understand, and also you question phrases such as service users, outpatients unit, and job titles like making experiences count manager.
For what it's worth, I'm deeply sympathetic to that last point.
Even, I think, referring to patients as service users, I think patients regard themselves as patients. But it extends to things like the 7-day report, which I said were covered in acronyms So how someone outside the profession is meant to understand that.
Yeah. You state that if an NHS trust is going to apologise, they should do it properly. No, I apologise if, but rather, I am sorry. Is that right?
There are examples from the letters I've shared with the inquiry where I think even the chief executive apologised if I thought somebody's actions had not reached the standard that I expected. Or what about the standard that the trust expected? I think also when the chief executive officer followed up on the meeting I'd had with his colleagues, he picked up on a point made by one of the people at that meeting that Liam's issues were complex.
Mm-hmm.
I refute that. Liam had dark periods, yes, I accept that. He just didn't have the coping mechanisms that the trust could have provided to deal with them. To me, that's pretty basic. And compared with things we hear and read about other people's trauma and the support that they receive, this is a very, very straightforward case in my view. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are a number of moving parts, and that will come to another recommendation. But that's not of Liam's making. That's what the trust chooses to do and how it chooses to deliver its service. So in other words, Liam's issues were not complex. The manner in which it was being delivered was complicated.
Yeah. Thank you. You give as a recommendation that agencies must be fit for purpose, and you give a specific concern in relation to NACRO and wondering what value NACRO brought. Is that right?
Yeah. So, of course, outsourcing in some circumstances is both necessary in order to buy in expertise. I suspect occasionally it's used for cost-cutting measures. But in any event, that doesn't absolve the trust from making sure that they deliver a service in line with the patient plan to the standard the trust has set itself.
Yeah.
And it should ensure that anyone or any organisation it uses can and will, and on an ongoing basis does, deliver a service to the right standard. In NACRO's case, I merely raised this because what was their role? Was their role to merely provide accommodation, in which case, why were they providing accommodation rather than any other organisation? Or again, rather like the ward, or rather like other places where Liam stayed, was it really just a holding pen of people with issues who might not be good for each other?
Yeah. Thank you. And there are four more recommendations. Invest in technology, and we've spoken about the use of hard copy letters and fax. You then recommend, in relation to leadership and professionalism, you ask for empathy and that those who seek leadership roles are qualified, that they are professional, committed to patient care, and genuinely want to work in the area of medicine, I think is what you're saying there.
Yeah, and this goes right to the very top of any organisation, but we're talking about trust here. The leadership of the trust has got to be empathetic to the patients that they have the responsibility of helping.
You also ask that family members are treated equally, and you've given some evidence today and also in your statement about some of the differences in which you and Liam's mother were treated. You give us the example that correspondence was generally sent to Liam's mother, and also she was offered emotional support following his death, whereas that support had not been offered to yourself.
Yeah.
And finally, in relation to inquests, you recommend that the trust put forward representation at inquests that are appropriate, and also suggest that coroners perhaps should have more powers to address the issues that they hear about in relation to particularly recurring themes. Is that right? I am incredibly grateful to you for the evidence that you've given. That completes the questions that I have. Chair, do you have any questions?
I have no further questions.
I'm very grateful. I wonder whether we have a photograph of Liam that we would like to put up for a few seconds, following which we're going to have a break to ensure that there are no more additional questions for you. If there are no more additional questions for you, then we will rise for the day.
Okay.
If there are, then we will come back to ask those. But if
Okay.
I could ask that the picture be put up, please. Thank you. Mr. Branham, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. We've worked you very hard, but you've given us a lot to think about, and I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just very finally, tomorrow we will be resuming at 10 a.m. and we will be hearing from Lydia Fraser-Ward and from Alan Oxton. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Ms. Paxton, very much indeed.